We're going not back to the days of certain times when you could buy a knighthood in Victoria if you lost enough money to the Premier playing cards, but just to a few years ago when we were uncertain as a nation as to what we should do about the threat of climate change. And so we return to uncertain times. As you'd be aware, the government's attempt to abolish the carbon tax failed to pass the Senate last week, so an important function with this panel is to update you on the likely passage of that legislation, what the Coalition's policy actually is and what it will require of industry. And then the questions for debate will be, should investors be content to wait for governments to take the lead on this critical issue or devise their own strategies to deal with the impact of climate change on the financial value of investments, which I imagine is easier said than done. So let me introduce our panellists. I'll go from left to right. We start with the Honourable Gordon Haggart, Chief Executive Officer of ACSI. We come to Sir Nathan, always a welcome contributor to any panel discussion. Sir Nathan Fabian is the Chief Executive of the Investor Group on Climate Change, and they focus on the impact climate change has on the financial value of investments. The Honourable Greg Combe can be Lord Combe as far as I'm concerned.
Indeed.
Yes, and he's an AM as well, but that's as nothing to his lordship. Former Climate Change Minister, Principal Advisor, Industry Super Australia and Director, IFM Investors. And always good to give a gong to a public servant who has not been elected to office, and in fact I think that's a requirement of the new award system. And so please make welcome all of the panellists, including our final panellist, Dame Anthea Harris, Chief Executive Officer of the Climate Change Authority. I'll start with Lord Combe. May I call you Greg?
Let me reflect upon it for a moment. I think it's okay.
I noticed that a real Lord, the Conservative Lord Deben, a former chairman of the British Conservative Party, has been pretty cranky about the Australian government's approach to climate change. He said it's so unintellectual as to be unacceptable. That's his opinion. And he notes in his global report that we are only one of 66 countries that's actually dismantling a working carbon price. Now, the Coalition government says they have an alternative. So as we try to work out what it is and whether it will work, what's the suite of possibilities? What are the levers that you choose from to get your result in terms of climate change?
Well, the starting point I think is also always very important in this debate, and that is that if you respect the scientific evidence, it follows that you accept and will put public policy in place to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And then the issue confronting any public policy makers is, well, what are the options available to achieve that and what are the implications of it? So sitting there as I was a few years back thinking about those options, essentially a couple of categories. One is you can adopt a market mechanism, that is to attach a price signal to greenhouse gas emissions to provide an incentive for businesses that are emitting greenhouse gas to cut their emissions. And that's of course the path that the Gillard government followed. Alternatively, you might look at regulating greenhouse gas emissions, for example, telling coal-fired power stations that they can only emit so much greenhouse gas per megawatt of electricity. Or alternatively, you could do where this government is advocating and take a subsidy approach, that is pay money to try and provide an incentive for businesses to cut emissions. But the central thing in all of that that's of key interest to investors and anyone in the economy is, what is the cost of abating that greenhouse gas for each of those options? And why, in any rational policy debate, wouldn't you take the lowest cost option? And the lowest cost option for reducing greenhouse gas emissions by any assessment is a market mechanism where you attach a price signal. And it's not an academic question. It's something that affects investors and consumers very profoundly. The cost of these policy mechanisms that are adopted will be met within the economy by investors and consumers at the end of the day, and it's only rational to take the lowest cost option.
Okay, so the Coalition is taking this subsidy option. Now, Anthony, you've been involved in writing papers for state governments, for federal governments involved with devising these schemes. From what you can understand from the Green Paper, what is direct action and how does it work?
There are a number of components, as we understand, but the centrepiece is the Emissions Reduction Fund, and through that measure, the government intends to tender, basically have a reverse auction for people to bid in to sell emissions reductions into that fund. So if you've got a project to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, first of all you have to find a methodology that suits that particular type of project, and then you can tender, and if you win then you'll get money once you've actually done the project and you've reduced greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay. Now, you only get the money after you've reduced the emissions?
That's the current policy, yes.
Okay, so there's a pot of money. If you come up with a plan that involves reducing emissions, you can get your hands on that pot of money. And so there's a string of ifs there and the paydays at the end. Is there any incentive or disincentive for industries to do that? Are they required to do it?
No, they're not required to do that, so that leg of it is entirely voluntary. The other part of the policy, which is...
And just briefly, if you don't do it in the terms of this green paper, if you don't go to all the bother of writing all these papers in order to get this money to fund what you're doing, are you penalised in any way if you emit too much as a result?
The policy does make provision for a penalty or a safeguard mechanism, as it's been called, if for emissions that go above a baseline, but we don't have details of how that baseline might be set yet, or the size or nature of any penalty or safeguard mechanism. So that's something that we really don't have a lot of detail about yet.
But there is some detail, isn't there, around the exemptions that industries might be able to get from those penalties, so that if they're conducting business as usual, they might be exempt from it. And some commentators have said that might mean that you'd have to work really hard to get yourself penalised. Is that your reading of it? I'm conscious that you're a public servant, you don't want to offer commentary.
Well, certainly that has attracted a lot of discussion, and we'll wait and see where that ends up. But certainly the notion of a penalty above business as usual, I mean, there's no reason for anybody to emit any more greenhouse gas emissions than business as usual. So we'll see where that ends up.
Greg, I mean, you know, these are your political opponents, but as objectively as you can is basically...
I'm a free citizen now.
Right, you've been freed. Basically, am I right in thinking the system is if you emit above a baseline, you are penalised. If you emit below the baseline, you are credited. But we don't know what the baseline is. There's no penalty, most commentators say, if you get it wrong and you emit too much. And so you have this situation where industry can continue to emit with no penalty for doing so, and government is busy buying up emissions. Isn't that sort of like filling up a bucket with a hole in it?
Yeah, well, I mean, the policy is stupid and ridiculous and no one can understand it.
Right.
I mean, that's an independent observation. I mean,
but actually
Lord Deben, I think, took it a little bit further.
Has a similar view.
Yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous and it'll create a lot of uncertainty for business, so it's a particularly pertinent consideration. The issue that you've ultimately got to get down to is how much does it cost per tonne of greenhouse gas to get your emissions down? If you're serious about addressing climate change and you establish a target, say to 2020, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, there's a volume of gas that has to be reduced to achieve that target. How much does it cost per tonne of greenhouse gas? And this subsidy scheme that the Abbott government is proposing, it's going to cost a bomb if they are serious about reaching a emissions reduction target. And just to give some comparison of what I'm really referring to here, of course, the carbon price that we introduced is $23 a tonne. If you take a policy position like solar panel deployment, for example, on household rooftops, and you say that is our emissions reduction method, put aside other goals, that's our emissions reduction method. The productivity costed the abatement cost of the deployment of solar panels, if you're trying to reduce each tonne of greenhouse gas, is as much as $450 a tonne.
Right.
And that cost is borne by the community. And in the same way with direct action, when anyone can ultimately figure out how much it's actually going to cost, it will cost the community far more than a market mechanism like the carbon price arrangement that's been put in place.
to fund the ERF. With respect, you did lose that argument. Can I ask Nathan?
It'll go for a while.
Do you see any prospect that this scheme could work to send an incentive to industry to reduce emissions?
Only at the margin. The scale of the deals likely to be on offer will probably be quite small. And so, yeah, somebody might bid for an energy efficiency project they were already going to do to have a partial subsidy for that project of a few $1 million. The question for us as an investment community is, what difference does that make to Australia's emissions? What difference does that make to the emissions of the companies we invest in? And the answers to those questions are effectively zero.
Okay, so there's no strong price signal as far as you can say it to industry, leaving aside moral arguments or arguments about risk and all the rest of it, in terms of black letter law to actually compel them to do anything on that basis.
Well, there's no compulsion at all. There's no obligation. The option to participate is entirely voluntary, and the incentive to participate is very low. So we think the most likely outcome is that the scheme is not even fully utilised.
So you don't think it'll cost a bomb? You think they could potentially have money in the delightfully named Earth?
Well, the scheme won't go the distance, in my view. It can't do anything like the kinds of reductions that we need out to 2030 that the Climate Change Authority pointed out in their recent report, which is a range of 40 to 60% reductions below 2000 levels is likely to be necessary for Australia. It's unlikely that a subsidy-based scheme could give us the 5% reduction by 2020, much less that longer-term target. And so the longer-term target's 40 to 60, and you think this will struggle to give us 5% reductions by 2020? It will. It's too expensive.
That's a really important point. I preface my remarks by saying, if you are serious about achieving the targeted emissions reductions, it will cost a bomb.
Right.
The Coalition's policy. And the
but
issue that Nathan's pointing to is that...
He's already said on the record, I'm not going to keep pouring money into it.
It's a con job because they're not serious about the emissions reduction task.
All right. Well, Gordon, that brings us neatly to you. How do investors respond to that? If the strong price signal is removed, should it change the way super funds invest?
Well, I think clearly as the politics change, then the price of assets will change. I mean, that's what we're all talking about. We're talking about incentivising certain parts of the economy and disincentivising others. So absolutely they should react. The policy frameworks here in Australia and elsewhere around the world are very dynamic, and that's why prices are dynamic, and they're very uncertain as well. So investors are trying to get their head around a Herculean analytical task. I guess it's really difficult.
And that's why you're here, Gordon.
Well, thanks for setting the expectations so low in that respect. But, we're here, the organisation I represent is a part of the investor response, I think. But to be clear, it's the investor response to do a better job of investment, to do a better job at understanding the difference between price and value, and a better job of using the ownership rights that accrue to investors. So
what's the first step on that journey? I mean, we can pose the question to the whole panel about whether or not we should see activism from superannuation trustees in trying to get action in similar ways to they have around executive pay. But take us right back to tin tax. How would you start the process, that Herculean process of figuring out where the incentives and disincentives lie?
I mean, I think as an investor, you have a number of options at your disposal for dealing with this issue. The first one is just to take better investment decisions. I mean, I talked about the difference between price and value, and anyone that does active management of any variety is essentially saying, well, I believe the market is wrong in some respect. I believe the market is pricing assets incorrectly. And the most common reason for that we find is because the market tends to be pretty myopic. It tends to be short-term, whereas super funds, and you would hope most investors, are trying to invest for the long term. So if you take that premise, then you can try to make a better guess of what the value of assets is than the market. And that can be kind of top-down decision-making in terms of your strategic asset allocation, your risk budgeting, and so on, or it can be individual assets you or your managers pick bottom-up. So that's kind of the first area, making better investment decisions. There's also the whole domain of ownership rights. So whenever you buy anything, you have a formal or an informal right to tell the agents that you use to manage that asset what they should be doing. And
throw your weight around.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, and it's not for the fun of it. It's because it's your capital that's at risk. I mean, that's what we do. That's Axie's business, is to represent owners. And it's not, as I say, just to give everyone the warm fuzzies about saying things. It's because principal agent theory suggests that if you just let agents run amok, they tend not to do a very good job. Whereas,
Nathan, what is actually define the argument for action? Because in this country, the science, you still argue about the science. You can't even get past, if I drop this pen, it's called gravity, and we can all agree what will happen, Yes, indeed.
It's actually not much more complex than that. If you accept the science of climate change, and that is...
So is this a moral reason that people should take action in terms of safeguarding members' entitlements? That's not their role. What is the rationale for action?
Well, it's, I think, relatively straightforward, and that is that there's economic impact from climate change events that will affect investments. It'll affect economies, it'll affect growth, it'll affect investment returns. And so the question for investors is how you are going to survive that kind of environment. And of course, can you play a role in avoiding the worst possible outcomes related to those? And if you want to bring this down to an Australia-specific situation, it's even simpler. The question is, do we want to have companies to invest in Australia that are competitive? And if we don't start to transition our economy and have emissions-efficient economies and industries, we won't have strong, world-class local companies to invest in. And that increases cost, that will change the way the industry operates, and of course has negative consequences for the Australian economy and our beneficial members.
Certainly we'd agree with that from the Climate Change Authority's perspective. There's really two things that talking to investors have talked to us about. So certainly the long-term impacts of climate change will definitely have impacts on the valuation of different types of assets. And also the types of policies that governments put in place will have short and longer term implications for investments as well. So both of those things need to be looked at. Certainly all investors have spoken to us about the need for some kind of stability and predictability in terms of policies and goals. So the Climate Change Authority has made recommendations about short-term and long-term goals for emissions reductions to help guide so that investors can think about where the economy needs to be going for the long term, even if they're not sure about the details of different policies.
And are you advocating that investors embrace these goals and not wait to follow government's embrace of them?
We're reacting to the fact that investors have told us that they would find it useful, that they need long-term goals about where emission reductions are going would be very helpful for them. So, just more information. And they've also told us that policy predictability and some degree of stability is also tremendously important.
In absence of that, though, Greg, don't you end up with a situation where if you're sitting around setting the investment parameters, you say, well, we can't invest in renewable technologies. There's a review of renewable energy targets that could have a profound effect on this investment, and your first obligation is to ensure that your members do well for their retirement.
Yes, of course, and it's in that vein that you have to consider the issues that Anthea raised just very carefully. And it is an issue of risk for investors, and you can reduce it to some fairly simple propositions, I think. For example, if you're an investor, by whatever means, in a company that might invest in rail track, what are the engineering standards that you have bought into here? Can they survive 35 successive days of plus 40 degrees C heat? Will they buckle and bend? What is the potential cost of that? What are the insurance implications? If you invest in port facilities, what are the potential costs and the risk and the implications of rising sea levels? These are matters of empirical assessment. What's the risk in a whole pile of other asset classes that you may be investing in, including in the equities market, of companies that have investments in a whole range of physical assets? Coastal property is another one that's pretty obvious. Insurers have to be thinking very carefully about all of that as well, and are. But beyond that, there are more general questions of risk. What is the economic cost? Some of the issues that I pointed to before, when you're in particular asset classes, of government policy to address this, of the mechanism by which greenhouse gases might be reduced. There's an economic efficiency argument and the cost implications for your assets to be considered. And then what you're pointing to, the regulatory risk of constant juggling of these policy positions. It's obviously a very tough environment for investors in renewable energy for the reason that this is not settled. And I would say, I noticed that, you know, the comments, and it often gets to this, put the politics to one side. That's fine. But an audience such as this, and investors, and if you are discharging your responsibilities on behalf of those you are representing as superannuation trustees, these are critical issues to consider, and the investment community needs to take views about them. That's not politics, that's just looking rationally at the risks associated with climate change.
Yeah, I'll pick that up, a couple of things. So our estimate is there's at least $1 billion of deals of renewable energy target potential projects sitting on the sidelines today. The potential investment opportunity set of a full RET, a full renewable energy target that's not wound back, is about another 18 billion. Gary's nodding. You know, these are pretty big numbers, and these are the scale of investments that would attract our community, and that's quite important. The other thing to say is that, and I think this is picking up what Greg's saying, climate change exists as a risk and an investment issue regardless of what happens on carbon pricing in Australia. It's going to affect all of our asset classes everywhere we invest. And so it's important for global investors to understand what's happening offshore. Most other countries are moving ahead. And it's easy to think that's not happening because of the local debate, but that is patently not true. Anthea might want to comment on this, but I'll just give you some simple numbers. In 1997, there was around 40 climate-related regulations globally. In 2004, there was 100. In 2013, there was 490. We are on an exponential scale of increasing regulation around climate. We need to, as investors, like we do with any trend, look through what is going to happen in the next few years and how that's going to affect the sectors we invest in and the way we seek and make our allocations. And we will get seriously distracted if the current government's approach, which is pretty close to a stalling tactic, in my view, if we get distracted by that from the fundamental risk of climate change. And so we need to keep focusing on that issue.
I mean, we're sort of circling around this issue of, you know, you do the full audit, you really analyse risk and have a big think about how you're going to do that at the audit committee, no doubt on the board and right throughout the organisation. But then how do you exercise, as we were saying before, Gordon, how do you throw your weight around? I noticed that Norway's government is investigating whether its sovereign wealth fund, which is apparently one of BHP's top 3 shareholders and the world's biggest fund, should be banned from investing in coal, oil and gas. What about that issue of divestment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly a legitimate option. I mean, that making a divestment decision is an investment decision. It's a decision not to invest, and that can be financially driven or it can be morally driven or whatever it might be. But I think, I mean, I represent investors where the consensus is that there's a huge financial interest in looking at this issue. And you know, for that reason, they're mostly looking towards the engagement side of things and remaining as owners and affecting the way that the companies they already own behave and adapt to this issue. However, I wouldn't say that anything is off the table. I think you do have those 3 weapons. You can make different investment decisions, you can use your rights, and you can try to affect the regulatory outcome as well. And I think, you know, it's not an either or. I think all of those are legitimate, financially motivated tactics.
Greg, have you got any views on those tactics, divestment versus influence?
Well, obviously people will be considering them. I'm familiar with that debate in Norway. But perhaps it's because where I've been for the last few years, I think the most important thing is for the investment community to argue for environmentally effective and economic rational policy responses from government, as well as assessing risk from an investor's standpoint of assets in which investments are made. It is important to articulate publicly that the most efficient cost-effective way and way to give the greatest stability and mitigate risk for investors is to have a rational public policy response. And that's what's disappointed me, in fact, in this country, in that the business community and investors, I don't think, have been sufficiently vocal about the importance of that. In some other jurisdictions I've been to, it's obviously in Europe, it's a pretty vibrant discussion. And they expect and demand of governments respect for empirical evidence, for science, and rational, economically efficient policy responses.
And do you think that's a more important thing to do than try to effect change quietly in conversations in boardrooms?
I think all of it can be done. Conversations need to be had everywhere, but ultimately, if we are going to achieve the necessary emissions reduction task, both in our own economy and internationally, governments have to act. It's an issue, as we've seen in our domestic political experience over the last 5, 6, 7 years, an issue that can be divisive but easily exploited by opportunists. The business community and the investment community, I think, have a very important role to play to say, listen, let's just stick to the facts here. And as investors, this is what we would like to see happen in public policy. You know, we don't want to be paying $450 a tonne for the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, thanks. We'd like to have the most economically efficient response, the cheapest response that achieves the reductions that we need.
But Gordon, I mean, as that video showed at the beginning, as Prue Goward was saying, there'll be some people who think that their trustees should be acting in that way, and there'll be some people who frantically disagree with that point of view.
Sure, and I think that's what makes being a trustee so difficult. You have to kind of disentangle all the pros and cons about taking a particular course of action. I personally think that the evidence that suggests this is a really material financial risk is extremely strong. And there's a very strong case for acting on all of the fronts, including the one that Greg just talked to. So,
and do you think, on balance, mum and dad investors, people who as Anne-Marie Corboy was saying, have small amounts in superannuation that will top up their pensions. We're not talking about people who've got millions and millions of dollars. Expect their super fund to beat the drum in public in that way, or want them to.
I think some do and some don't, but I think they all expect the super fund to be, you know, to discharge the duty of care they have to those people effectively, and that means thinking about risk holistically and for the long term over a time horizon that's meaningful for the member. And if you do that, you can't really sweep climate change under the carpet as an investment issue.
Because, Nathan, that there is a view that softly and quietly, and have a little meeting in a courtyard in Canberra and a quiet little meeting in a boardroom, and perhaps kind of, how muscular do you think this should be?
There's nothing wrong with quiet conversations. The question is, what do you do if the person to whom you're talking disagrees with you? And that's the situation we've got with some companies and with some political representatives. And so we need to provide evidence, we need to have sensible conversation. You can never step away from those channels. But there are some company boards who would prefer not to reduce their company's emissions. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. The question for us is, what do we do about it as an investment community?
And how do you answer that?
Well, I think that one of the areas of important work going forward is how we assess the competency of boards on climate risk. Do boards have an ability to interpret science? Do they have the governance skill to manage this risk? These are central governance questions that are comfortable territory for institutional investors, and we need to apply the same level of scrutiny to climate change that we applied to REM, because the value at risk is multiples of the value at risk around poor REM practices. And I think that will become increasingly clear.
I'm wondering whether or not this is a conversation individual funds can have in isolation from industry nationally or internationally. I mean, is there a framework, Andrea, that exists or could be formed to provide a platform for collective, coordinated and sort of consistent action, whether just within Australia or around the world?
I'm not sure that there's such a platform, but there's no shortage of reviews of policy that go on in this country, and there's certainly plenty of opportunities to make public comment about about the big picture things, about action on climate change more broadly and what Australia's role in that should be, and also individual policies. There's currently a review in place on the renewable energy target, for example. So there's no end of opportunities to make public comment about these things if that's what individual funds want to do.
I mean, I think those groups do exist. I mean, and they're not perfect, perhaps, but Nathan's group is one. The organisation I represent is another. There are international analogues of those organisations. There's the PRI, which is a great way for people to come together and say, you know what, this is really tough. How can we help each other? So I think there are multiple flowers blooming on that front.
I think when obviously there are many different interests in an economy, and occasionally, of course, some business interests will articulate a vision, surprise, surprise, that is consistent with their book, essentially. So you might get coal-fired electricity generating companies arguing a position about climate change that is obviously in their, how they perceive to be their short-term commercial self-interest. Investors in those companies are being taken for a ride because that's not where the world is at or where it's going. The investors in those companies are quite entitled to pay attention to what the CEO might say in those circumstances and say, well, actually, you know, to mitigate the risk that we're exposed to by having an investment in a coal-fired electricity generator and distributor, the long-term interest of our investment is not to be, you know, in a position supporting the CEO on that point, denying the science or saying there's no need to take any action. And that's where, in my experience as a minister, investors can really, I think, have a significant impact. By and large, my experience was that in the business community there's a recognition that this has to happen. Most of the major corporations have done a shadow carbon price in their investment decisions for many years. I remember Rio Tinto telling me they've been doing it for the better part of 20 years. They expect a carbon price to be introduced in an economy, but as long as they can continue to mine coal and emit methane gas in their coal mining operations, for example, without having to address the issue, well, they'll probably keep doing it. But the investors need to be saying, well, it's actually in our long-term interest in investing in your organisation that you deal with this issue rationally and you support an economically efficient approach to reducing emissions. And one of the major coal mining companies, after it had a hell of a fight for 2 years with them, after it introduced carbon pricing, of course, started capturing their methane gas emissions and realised then that they were able to not only reduce their emissions and therefore their liability below the threshold that attracted the carbon price, but they were able to make a buck out of it by generating electricity with it and selling it back into the grid. And that was what our argument was, and it was a rational economic position to put, but they just wouldn't have it. But if there was a bit of investor interest behind it, saying actually that's quite rational, it would make a big difference.
But don't you get down to basic human nature? Anyone can take this one. Along the lines of something needs to happen, but I don't want to take a hit to my return on investment on my retirement savings, and you're my superannuation trustee, and I don't want you to, I mean, we need to do it, maybe do it to his retirement savings, but for me, you stick with that mob because they're making a great return.
Well, if you think you know, they always talk in investment about beating the other investors to the exit. So if you think you're kind of Cinderella at the ball and you can ride out Greg's situation where it's free to make those emissions forever, and then suddenly rational regulation kicks in and you beat every other investor to the door and you sell to them, then yeah, if you think that's a viable strategy, then that might be a good way to go. But you know, I think the larger you are, and you know, the big funds are big funds, and the larger, the less nimble you are. I don't think that's a viable strategy for any investor, frankly. But I think, you know, that kind of the nonsense of that approach speaks to thinking now about value versus price on this issue.
We weren't ready for the way companies were going to react through this policy lobbying process on carbon pricing. That's one of my regrets of the last few years.
How do you mean?
I think there was a group of companies who used the fear of carbon pricing to lobby for better deals. And in the public debate, that played as opposition to sensible reform. And so not only did we have the companies who were opposed to sensible reform arguing that way, it appeared that we had this other great swathe of companies who wanted a better deal or more protection, also opposed to sensible reform.
So just opportunistic objections rather than ideological objections.
I agree. And as an investment community, I wish we'd been on top of that, because we could have done something about it, and we'll have to probably pick it up next time, because that type of rational response from a board who gets the issue, supports sensible reform but wants the best short-term deal, can undermine the sensible debate. And I think as an investment community, with good engagement, a good open conversation early, raising concerns about some of the consequences of that approach, we can take away some of that pain. So that's something to work on for next time.
I bet you are in fulsome agreement with that, Greg. You looked over your shoulder and there weren't no one there.
Well, Anthea, of course, worked with me when I was Minister in a public service role, doing a lot of the detailed work on that, and establishing a rational, fair, efficient and environmentally effective framework, if you like, that's not going to distort investment decisions from in between businesses other than by reference to a fair carbon pricing arrangement. So it's a very difficult task, but one that people like Anthea did exceptionally well when I was the Minister, and we put in place a framework where all of that pushing and lobbying was going on, and it was ferocious. Now, at one point in time, we were negotiating with dozens and dozens of industries and individual businesses where, of course, a lot of that pushing was going on, and it was difficult to resolve, but we ultimately did put in place, I'm very confident of it, a rational and distributionally equitable arrangement for carbon pricing in all of the key industries, but it's certainly a very significant public policy challenge to do it. And
public policy failure, wouldn't you have to accept if you had the workings of a system that was as good and was such a good piece of public policy? Wasn't that the moment to do the persuading? Wasn't that the moment to do that piece of work? And how much harder is it for these men and women in this room to do that work now that that argument wasn't won?
Well, it wasn't a public policy failure, in my opinion, but wouldn't be surprised to have me say that. It was a political failure.
Sure.
Tony Abbott won the politics of it hands down. It's undeniable. It's an issue, as I observed before, that can be made divisive by politicians and others, and where it's rife for opportunism. You can run scare campaigns quite patently about the cost of living when you're making major reforms like this. But nonetheless, it's worth bearing in mind on that front that it was introduced and the world didn't end. There's a coherent investment environment in which to make decisions, putting aside the instability over the RET and the potential repeal of carbon pricing, but it was achieved from a public policy point of view, and it works, and emissions are coming down, and the emissions intensity, that is the amount of pollution per megawatt hour of electricity in our electricity system, which is where most of our greenhouse gas emissions come from, you can plot it coming down from the time that we introduce carbon pricing, because it's a rational economic approach. It makes electricity generation by highly polluting generators relatively more expensive compared to generators that produce less pollution per megawatt hour of electricity, and relatively more expensive compared to renewable energy. All it does in economic parlance is price an externality into production. Now, someone tell me what's irrational about that? Why is that the end of the world again? It is not. And the issue won't go away, because the science is, just because Tony Abbott wins an opportunist argument doesn't mean that all the scientific evidence falls away. The issue will stay. I'm
conscious that we do need to come to questions, and I note that the questions are starting to come in. Please send them in, and we will get to them. This is one you hear a bit. In the US, Greg, CO2 emissions have reduced to 1990 levels due to the natural gas revolution. Shut your eyes and won't the problem go away? So they're saying without government carbon policy, why won't that happen here?
Well, there are many carbon policies, in fact, in the US economy in different jurisdictional levels. But, of course, that has come about in the US as a consequence of the discovery and exploitation of shale gas.
Yeah.
And it's been a revolution in the energy market in the United States, like just a hugely dramatic...
Could coal seam gas solve the problem here?
We've got great reserves of coal seam gas and shale gas in this country. Shale gas is quite a bit deeper down, so coal seam gas is more viable to exploit. In New South Wales, where I'm now living, of course it's an issue that's complex and problematic with understandable concerns about the environmental impact, but ultimately if we're going to make a step change in our greenhouse gas emission profile and move from coal-fired to gas-fired electricity, then we need to be exploiting it. In Queensland, a lot of those steps have been taken and there's now a large export industry here, but without a carbon price in our economy, investment will continue to go into coal-fired, high-pollution electricity generation.
Because that's what the signals are set for.
I mean, Tony Abbott's policy position is a boom for the high-polluting coal-fired generators in Victoria that use brown coal.
Anthea, can I ask you, just before we come to this next question, Gordon was talking before about a rush for the exits. Thinking about what is happening in other parts of the world, thinking about what's happening in China when they get those days and days of pollutions and people are getting restless about this. You know, when does the stampede begin?
Well, we look around the country, around the world at what other countries are doing, and it's fair to say no country is doing enough. All countries need to do more if you're taking the science seriously. But that said, it's a myth that's often stated here in Australia that other countries are doing nothing at all, and really people who say that need to get out more. So countries like China, for example, is actually taking this issue very seriously, and they've got a lot of programs in place to reduce greenhouse gas emissions compared to what they would otherwise be. They've been shutting a lot of coal-fired power stations, small, wildly inefficient ones, replacing them with more efficient plant. They've been trying to reduce coal consumption overall for lots of reasons, including the appalling air pollution problems that they're having there. So they've got multiple reasons for it, not just actioning on climate change. Stringent controls on standards for vehicles, you know, the emissions from vehicles as well. Australia doesn't have any controls on vehicle emission standards, and huge investments in renewable energy, and also a huge nuclear program as well. There's lots going on in China, and similarly in the US. Yes, gas has played a significant role in reducing emissions in the US, and that was in part a deliberate strategy, not necessarily driven by greenhouse gas emission policy, but the US government deliberately went slowly in terms of granting export licences for their own domestic gas, and a deliberate strategy to suppress domestic gas prices, really to try and encourage the local manufacturing industry, which it seems to have done. So now that's a policy choice. Of course, they've missed out on higher export revenues because of that choice, and they're gradually allowing those exports to go ahead. But that's not nearly enough for the US to meet its own quite stringent targets, and they are doing a whole bunch of other things, going down the regulatory path. So again, more stringent standards on vehicle emissions, and they'll be putting regulations in place for new coal-fired power stations as well as existing coal-fired power stations, plus a whole range of other incentive regimes for renewable energy and energy efficiency and a whole bunch of other things at both the state and the federal level.
Yes, sorry to interrupt on, but just on the China point that Anthea touched on, I had the opportunity twice a year to meet with my Chinese counterpart when I was the Minister for Climate Change, and it's not just that, you know, they respect the science and they want to reduce the emissions intensity of their economy. Of course, they're very mindful of the fact that without having these policy measures in place, without carbon pricing, and they're introducing carbon pricing through emissions trading schemes, the same that was done here, they understand that by doing that, you create the investment environment where investments are made in technological innovations, where you start to transform industry, because without the price signal, business doesn't have the incentive to be thinking about this. Well, how can I do this more efficiently? How can I increase my output but reduce my emissions intensity at the same time? And almost immediately that carbon pricing was introduced into our economy, I had the privilege of seeing industries, you know, numerous industries and businesses close up. The innovation started, the application of technologies, the search overseas for mechanisms to reduce emissions, and to apply technologies and circumstances here. In the abattoir industry, which hasn't been noted for its innovative approach in some instances in the past. They're high producers of greenhouse gas emissions as the blood and guts decompose essentially in settlement ponds. They immediately started looking for technologies where they could decompose blood and guts in a controlled environment, utilise the methane emissions to generate their own electricity. They became self-sufficient. Some of them sell electricity back into the grid, and they produce fertiliser and potable water as a side product. And it's transformed their competitiveness. And that's what's understood in China very well, that without the policy context, you don't drive the investment and the innovation that improves the competitiveness of your economy. And economies in the years to come that are reducing their emissions intensity, the amount of pollution they're emitting per GDP, the ones that are reducing their emissions intensity are the ones who are going to be competitive. And in our region, it is the most lunatic thing that we would be going backwards. We need to be at the competitive edge in this region, and we are not.
Can I add to that? Australia's 1.5% of global emissions domestically, but we're about 4.5% if you include all of our energy exports. That makes us a really big contributor to the problem, if we can say it that way. And so the competitiveness question for Australia should not be underestimated. If we don't create a domestic policy framework which encourages investment in competitive industries of the future, we will lose income when those energy sources fall off. And for those who say, don't worry, people are going to buy our coal for years, it's not an issue, I'd encourage you or your funds managers to relook at the forecasts. I think that we are moving into a phase quite quickly where the consensus assumptions, the recent consensus assumptions on energy mix, on technology costs and on climate regulation are dating very quickly. We're reaching price parity in many markets around the world for renewables, and subsidies are not required. We're seeing policy in China that may see China turn into a net coal exporter by 2020. These are not insignificant fundamental investment shifts. We need to understand them, and if any of our service providers' prejudices or old information is getting in the way of good, sensible investment progress, then there's a problem that we need to be addressing.
Gordon, there's a question there on the screen. So there's one hand tied behind trustees' backs, and that's the lack of a clear price signal from government at this time of flux in policy. And the question here, is there another arm tied behind your back? Is climate change an example of the failure of members' best interests requirements to take a broader holistic view for members nearing retirement?
That's not how I would characterise it. It's a failure of an analytical piece, I think. I mean, it's really difficult. There's a good human reason why markets are short-term, because it's much easier to imagine things that will happen in the next quarter or the next year and get your heads around that and reallocate your portfolio accordingly. Thinking about 5, 10, 20, 50 years is a lot more difficult. I spoke to at the outset to the difficulty of the analytical piece, and I think that is the failure here, that we just haven't cracked that nut yet. I don't think it requires you to take on all the responsibilities for your member's life in order to have a go at this. I think it, absolutely bang in line with the SIS Act, and the best financial interest is all the motivation you need to kind of plough into this issue, as far as I'm concerned.
2 more questions before we wrap. What are some clear examples that are obvious evidence of climate change, bracket, i.e., examples of the externality cost of some climate changing activity? Anyone want to have a go at that?
Oh.
Please, Anthea.
So we talked about this in a recent report that we've put out. So increased prevalence of heat waves, so that we know that where the likelihood of experiencing heat waves has increased right now because of climate change that's already occurred. And if we look ahead, the likelihood of heat waves is increasing significantly, which has huge implications potentially for human health, but also infrastructure investments as well. We can look at things like the likelihood of bushfire weather. So not necessarily bushfires, a whole bunch of factors affect whether you have a bushfire, but clearly bushfire weather is the main one. We can think about the likelihood of extreme weather events, so the likelihood of droughts increasing, and the likelihood of when it does rain, we're having floods, that likelihood is increased as well. So there's a whole range of a phenomena that the likelihood of them happening is already raised because of climate change, and looking ahead, increased again.
Anyone else want to throw?
Well, just when we were sitting around, every time there's an extreme weather event, and in government, ultimately, of course, governments need to foot the bill. And you might recall that some time back there was a flood levy applied following the cyclone in Queensland, and sitting there in government at expenditure review committees and looking at the budgetary implications of an increasing frequency in extreme weather events, recognising that not one single event you might be able to say, but scientists have been telling us that there'll be an increasing frequency and they'll be increasingly extreme. And then you're sitting there with the fiscal consequences, and the government is essentially the insurer. It's a very significant cost, and it passes through to the community, to all members of the community. And it's a damn sight more expensive, I can assure you, than the introduction of a risk mitigation strategy in the form of a carbon price. And the carbon price that was introduced at $23 a tonne had an implication on average for households of a $3.30 a week increase in electricity prices, for which a majority of households had that offset by tax cuts and increases in family tax benefits and the like. And I just assure you that from having the privilege of sitting inside a cabinet room looking at the numbers for this, that is a far better way for the Australian community to deal with this issue and to mitigate risk.
If we go.
Yeah, just another one. I mean, timberland is an asset class that's been very important for US investors and increasingly for investors in our part of the world as well. As the climate changes around certain regions which are popular for timberland investments, the incidence of pests goes up. You actually lose trees because there are more floral and fungal pests that attack those trees, and your fire risk goes up for those assets as well. So it's a clear investment cost based on that. There's a lovely story around that as well, that if you, one way to reduce your fire risk is to clear up all the biomass that sits around on the forest floor after you've harvested the trees. And you can actually then turn those into biomass pellets and sell them to German power stations to burn instead of coal. So you can mitigate a downside risk and create an upside risk as well, an opportunity.
And the final question, I think, is there a risk that the not-for-profit super industry will become the community conscience to fill the vacuum created by government?
I might have a quick go at that. I think that's always a risk, but that's not what this issue is about. You need to look at the fundamentals of what's happening here on climate, at what's happening on energy markets, at what's happening on regulation, and try to track through the substantial investment implications. The world's changing on this issue. The evidence is coming through quite clearly. For anyone who wants to talk about that, you can come to our group, go to our website. We just, a few months ago, put out 4 reports with 100 pages of examples of physical impacts and how that can affect sectors we invest in. And so, although that risk is present in our community, climate is a fundamental investment risk and will create opportunities, and we need to think about it in that frame.
And finally, if I can come to you, Greg, can we get a bit of free political analysis from you? So the carbon tax was, the repeal of the carbon tax didn't pass the Senate. Tony Abbott's, it's a fundamental election pledge to roll back the carbon tax. What do you think will happen there?
Oh, well, I don't know that I'm in any greater position than anyone else to analyse that, excepting one interesting little quirk in it all is that, of course, Clive Palmer's senators in the Senate will be important after July the 1st. Clive Palmer operates a nickel smelter in Townsville that is a large greenhouse gas emitter, and he has refused to pay his carbon price liability at that facility since the carbon price was introduced. And I've noticed with interest in his public comments that that's going to be the price of his support for repealing carbon pricing.
He wants it to be retrospective and everybody should get a cheque back for their carbon tax, which should be really simple to organise for all Australians.
Well, I'd watch that space because that's going to be an interesting negotiation and outcome.
But do you think, come what may, there'll be a double dissolution or whatever it takes to get rid of the carbon tax?
Well, I don't know. I hope that the Senate upholds rational policy that's environmentally effective, economically responsible and socially fair.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank the members of their panel. I won't use their honorifics. Greg Combay, Anthea Harris, Gordon Haggett and Nathan Fabian. Thank them for that.